There are days when I think that the only reason that Karen sticks around with me is because I'm tech support. Ty, you know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. Just because I came from the computer industry, that was light years ago. And a long time ago in a galaxy far away, I was visiting the service department in one of my stores. It was a large store, a big store, and a big service department, and we stayed busy. And while I was there at the front desk of the tech department, a man brought his computer to the desk and said it wouldn't turn on. And so the service manager took the machine back to the workbench, and he made a quick adjustment, and within 30 seconds he had it back to the customer, and he said, "That will be no charge, sir. It was just an ESO problem." And the man left with a smile on his face. And when he was gone, I told the service manager, "I've never heard of an ESO problem." He grinned and he said, "Equipment superior to operator." Back in the early days, both the power cord and the monitor cord could be plugged into the PC, and the man just hadn't plugged in his monitor. So the computer was working just fine. He couldn't see it. He said, "I didn't want to make him feel stupid." Those were the early days of personal computing, and I don't know if any of you remember back this far, but data was stored on floppy disks. And I know some of you remember the little 3.5s, well, and then there were the 5.25s before them, but I don't know if some of you remember there were floppy disks bigger than that for the old Tandy machines that you could serve dinner on, you know. But back then, data was stored on floppy disks, and there was a real estate office right next to our corporate headquarters, and they called us one day to go over and fix a computer problem. The office manager was in kind of a panic because someone had spilled a cup of coffee on the floppy disk that contained some very important sales data. And I had our head of tech go over there and talk to her, and he asked if they'd made the nightly backups that we had suggested they do. And she looked relieved and she says, "Yes, we make a copy of the discs every evening before closing." And she went to the file cabinet and produced a folder filled with paper, and each page contained a date and a Xerox picture of the floppy disk. That's not funny to some of you, but just... The moral of the story is, if you're going to have a backup plan, make sure it's a good one. Speaking of backup plans, turn to Genesis chapter 31. If you'll recall, I introduced Genesis chapter 30 with the having the dubious distinction of being one of the weirdest chapters in the entire Bible. Chapter 31 doesn't slow up much. Some very interesting happenings here, but I want to kind of bring you up to date on the soap opera that is the life of Jacob so far. Remember, he is in his father-in-law's country, in Laban's country, having married two of his daughters. And if you'll recall last week, that Jacob hatched a plot. And I'm still kind of on the fence as to whether God helped him with this some, but I think it was more him trying to help God, where he said, "Look, I'll take all the defect, all the cull sheep and goats, and in some little tricks he used, like breeding the strongest ones and giving Laban the weakest ones." What we find is that by the end of chapter 30, that Jacob has greatly increased his wealth at the expense of his father-in-law, because the flocks are still breeding, but he's given the weaker stock, the ones that could be a problem to his father-in-law, he's keeping the more hardy stock. Then in chapter 31, we take that with the quite predictable situation that Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything from our father and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." Now, I got to tell you, that was true. Is that Jacob's history? Is that his modus operandi? Well, yes, it is. His very name means deceiver. literally heel grabber, supplanter. And if you'll recall, he cheated his own brother out of his birthright and his inheritance. And now that Laban has gotten the better of him on the daughter deal, making him work 14 years for the wife he really wanted, now he's gotten back at Laban. So the two con men are just kind of working back and forth on each other, and now he has a good portion of Laban's wealth. Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. I'm looking at that in the Hebrew thinking, is that an accurate translation? That's pretty much word for word. The father-in-law was not happy with him. Well, can anybody blame him? Anybody who had an eyeball could tell what was going on here, that the flocks that might have been Laban's right here and Jacob's here have gone like this, and the wealth has moved the opposite direction. So the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. Once again, that's pretty amazing to me, It's pretty amazing to me that God has continually promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and now to Jacob that their line, that the family line would be great, that kings would come from the line, that it would be so numerous that it would be like the stars in the sky, even when they have behaved in a decidedly unworthy manner, which Jacob certainly has. But once again, God has come to him, and now he's come to him in a dream, and he said, you know what? I've got this land ready for you, and you're not there. So go back. Head back to the land that I promised you. Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. Let me stop right there. That seems like a curious way to describe Jehovah, to describe Yahweh God. But it probably is a very apt way, because at this point we have no indication that Rachel and Leah were believers. And I got to tell you, Jacob himself was kind of a squishy believer until he encountered God in the dream of the ladder or the stairway, in which he started referring to God as my God. But now you see he's talking about the God of my father. I think that's setting a historical landmark there. And he is a God-fatherer, but you notice that he didn't include his wives there. That's going to come up again later. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength. Yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. Now that's a little piece of information we don't have. It could be hyperbole. He just could have said something, like a million times. He keeps changing the deal. We don't know if it was literally 10 times. Could have been. We know a couple of times that he changed the deal. But this could have been just one more, or it could literally have been 10. But he said, look, your dad's changed the deal on me 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. Now, let me stop. And we got to examine that, because is that true? Did God take away Laban's livestock and give it to Jacob? In a manner of speaking, yes. But truth be told, he swindled his father-in-law. Now, did God allow that? Certainly he did. Did God bless that? Don't know. God would have prospered him had he just played it straight. I'm just here to tell you. Because God promised he would. He didn't have to cheat and lie to do it. God would have prospered him. But anyway, God gave him some of his father's livestock. And in breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. Now, that's kind of puzzling, because we don't know when this dream happened. We don't know if it happened before Jacob made this deal with his father-in-law to take all the cull stock, or if we don't know if it happened later. But the key is, he said, look, I'm doing that because Laban has taken advantage of you. God told him that. I am the God of Bethel, which, by the way, is where he met God in the staircase vision. where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land." So he's explaining all this to his wives, and in essence what he's saying, God told me to go back. So we need to go. I think at this point, he didn't know what Rachel and Leah's response would be. As their husband, they pretty well had to follow him. They had to go with him. But it could be that if they were pretty well tied in with their homeland, because they were going to go some 400 miles to the southwest and probably never see their families again, he thought they may well just kind of balk at that. But they replied, "Do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us." Well, there goes the family dynamic. And obviously, we got some tension going on here between the daughters and their father, because they see that the estate that he once had, and they would not, by the way, have been eligible for his estate since he had sons, but they did have a dowry, and apparently he spent that up. And what estate he did have now has dwindled. And apparently the relationship wasn't too good for them anyway. I don't know that they were all that happy that he sold them off under the circumstances that he did. Because look what they say. He sold us, and then he used up what was paid for us. So look what they say. "Surely the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children, so do whatever God has told you." So look what they say. All the wealth that used to be our father's is now over here in your camp. Surely that belongs to us and our children, so you do whatever God told you. Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go with his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. Now, just so you'll know, Paddan Aram is up north in what's now probably Syria, near the Turkish border up there. So they're a good long way away. And if you know Jacob, he's probably already arranged it so that he is grazing his flocks in the southern part of his country. And when the time came, he threw everybody on camels and made a break for it. That is not a speedy exit, by the way, because he's got a whole family, flocks and herds he's got to move along, but he takes off. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. We got to camp there for just a minute. Laban was gone, so Rachel, before she left, she sneaked into his tent, sneaked into his place of living, and stole his household gods. Don't you hate it when that happened? Anybody ever had your household gods stolen? I know it seems to be a concept that's a little foreign to us, but we got to remember that Laban was not a God-fearer, apparently. Laban was a pagan, just like the peoples around him, and they would have worshipped many gods. Okay, so you stop and think, why would he have these? Well, it was quite common at the time to have small idols, sometimes all arranged in a set, that you took with you whenever you traveled to invoke as protection in your travel. So a household would have had a little household shrine set up with the gods and all the figures there. And so she went and stole them from her father. Now that begs the question, why? Well, one thing, if she were a God-fearer, would she have taken those idols? She would have not. So she was a pagan also. So she went and got the idols. She was either really mad at her father or wanted those idols for protection, during what would have been a very long journey. I think it's probably the latter. But that tells us an awful lot about Laban and about her. Apparently, that apple didn't fall far from the tree either, that the dishonest father had a daughter who came in and stole from him. Okay? Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean that's Syrian, by the way, by not telling him he was running away. So he fled with all he had, crossing the river, that would have been the Euphrates, by the way, and heading for the hill country of Gilead. Now, he was a grown man, getting along in age by now. Why couldn't he have just traveled like he wanted? Well, because of the patriarchal system at that time meant that he had been living under the roof of Laban. Laban was acknowledged as the family head, and anything that Jacob did at this time, he really had to kind of clear through the head of the family. So to travel, particularly to take the daughters away, and he had given the daughters their servants. Remember Bilhah and Zilpah, they were still the property technically of Laban, so we really should have told him. Think Abraham and Lot, for example. Although Lot was Abraham's nephew, he was still under his authority. So he broke the law, broke the rules, and broke authority, and went and took off on his own. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. That would have been, by the way, about 50 miles. He probably could have gotten 50 miles. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. So Jacob had been traveling for 10 days. It just took 7 days, unencumbered by camels, women, children, and flocks, for him to take his household there. There's a little phrase there that you probably noticed with Abraham, in that the extended family was kind of a mini kingdom, in that the army that it raised would have been all the men in the family and the servants. So they gathered that group together, put together a posse like they used to do in the Roy Rogers films, and headed off for them, caught up with them in Gilead. When God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Now, was Laban a God-fearer? No. But this was a God, and even though he feared many gods, that would have gotten his attention. And he knew, remember, earlier we heard that he realized that God was favoring Jacob, so he respected God. And God came to him in a dream and said, "Don't say anything to him, either good or bad." That's kind of humorous, because wait till we get just a few verses along. Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him. And Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done?" Wait a minute. What did God just tell him? Don't say anything to him, good or bad. So he just couldn't stand it, though. As soon as he met up with Jacob, he said, "What have you done? You've deceived me." Do you realize how ironic that is? One deceiver, one con man says to another con man, "I can't believe you conned me. You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war," that you, by the way, worked 14 years for. "Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of tambourines and harps?" Anybody who thinks that was going to happen, raise your hand. Okay, we're in agreement. "You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You've done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" As he said something bad. Let's establish a point of reference again. When Laban said that God spoke to him, you notice how he described God, the God of your father Jacob. Now, he didn't necessarily say, "Your God," the God of your father spoke to me. So notice he didn't say it was your God, but we know that he was, but it certainly wasn't Laban's God. "Now you've gone off because you longed to return to your father's house, but why did you steal my gods?" I think that's really what got under his craw. Take my daughters, if you want, but don't run away with my gods. Jacob answered Laban, "I was afraid, because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if I find anyone who has your gods, he shall not live." So Jacob was pretty sure that nobody took his gods, and that perhaps, Laban had just mistaken them, but he said a very dangerous thing. Now, we have heard of people pronouncing dangerous vows in Scripture before. You particularly hear one in Judges that's hair-raising. And as soon as you read that, I don't know if you thought immediately, "Oh, this is not going to turn out well for Rachel," because he's made a vow here. "In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me. If so, take it. Now there's a little parenthetical. Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. Well, I certainly hope not. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two maidservants, and he found nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now, we're going to get a little background story. Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent, but found nothing. So, he's tearing the whole camp apart trying to find these gods. And then, in a place, listen, you know that the Bible is not made up pretty fiction, or you wouldn't hear something like you're about to hear here. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, but I can't stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." She's sitting on those gods, and she didn't want to have to get up because he's probably searching the camels too. So he searched but could not find the household gods. So now Jacob is filled with righteous indignation because he's been accused of taking something he knew he didn't take. So he's going to bow up and get right back in Laban's face. He was angry and took Laban to task. "What is my crime?" he asked Laban. "What sin have I committed that you hunt me down? Now that you have searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the two of you." Now, he says, "Look, I've been with you 20 years. Actually, it was probably a little longer than that, but it's a good round number. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself. And you demanded payment from me, whatever was stolen by day or night. This is my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. Now, listen, I'm reading this, but I want you to get the picture that he's up right in his father-in-law's face, and there's probably spit flying into his beard. I mean, he's really unhappy. He's wound up. He said, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night He rebuked you." So he said, "Look, bucko, don't think that it's just by accident that God came to you. Because He saw the fact that you'd been cheating me all this time and getting over on me, and all I want to do is go back home. And so God kind of put up the stop sign here and said, you don't go bother him." Laban answered Jacob, "The women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about the children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us." So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives, "Gather some stones." So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jegar Sahadutha, and Jacob called it Gilead. All right? By the way, that means mound of witness. They set up a little mound, which will be a pillar, and then they'll make an altar of it. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." That's why it was called Gilead. It was also called Mizpah, which also means lookout point, because he said, "May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember that God is a witness between you and me." So he reminds Jacob of the fact that they're supposed to have a witness when they make this type of covenant. There is none. So he said, even though no one is here with us, God is going to be our witness. That's one of the places that we get that phrase. God is a witness between you and me. Laban also said to Jacob, "Here is this heap, and here is this pillar. I've set it up between you and me. This is a witness, and this pillar is a witness. I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that you will not go past this heap." That's a red line in the sand I've heard about. "And this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. It's kind of interesting to me because all that's done, God obviously having favored Jacob, God playing a part in this transaction already, He still identifies Him as the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor. Not his God and not Jacob's God. So Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered a sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. After they'd eaten, they spent the night there. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. Let me just kind of give you a little look into the next couple of weeks. From whom did he flee when he left his home, when he left Canaan some 20 or more years ago? His brother. Why? Esau said he's going to kill him. So now God said return. Even after 20 some odd years, it's got to be in his mind, well, I'm going back to Esau. And you don't forget something like that. So he's going back, and then also something's going to happen in the next chapter that's one of the more puzzling occurrences in Scripture when Jacob actually wrestles with God. And it's the way that he gets the name Israel, by the way. So read ahead, if you will, because it's a very important chapter next week. The lesson today, though, one thing that jumped out at me is if you look back at verse 19, chapter 31, verse 19. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Even though it was plain to Jacob, and even plain to the pagan Laban, that God had been blessing over them and watching over them, she felt the need to have a bag of worthless, inanimate objects as a backup plan. I want you to stop and think about that. She may not have been a God-fearer, but she had lived with her husband for 20 years. She had to have known of his faith, the God that he worshiped, and the promise that God had made to him. And still, when it came time to leave, she wanted that backup plan. You know, it appears that her faith is very weak. But is she so very different from us? Think about that. It seems to be quite common that folks have a backup plan. And that's not all bad, okay? I've got carbonite, okay? You back up your computer. If you have insurance, you have a backup plan. If you carry a spare tire in your trunk, you have a backup plan. Okay, so you don't tell me, well, I rely strictly on God. If you've divested yourselves of all those things, you're pure, and I apologize. But most of us have a backup plan, one way or another. But let me tell you where we're not supposed to have a backup plan. Is there is one person, and one person only, that is sufficient for salvation. That's Christ Jesus. Only one. So you would think that backup plans for salvation would be totally unnecessary. But let me tell you what the majority of people in the world today do. They operate on their own strength, and if they call on the name of the Lord, they use Him as a backup plan. In other words, I'm fine until I run it in the ditch, and then I'm going to call on the name of the Lord. I think probably we've all done that at one time or another. Some people just do it as a matter of course. I love the phrase that I've heard so many times, well, let's say a little prayer. Couldn't hurt. Well, I don't know about you, Denny. I've had the request for that at the bedside of the hospital. I can't tell you how many times. Well, it couldn't hurt. Are you kidding me? I can't take God as just a backup plan. He's not an alternative. He's not a second option. He's the option. And yet, I see that in our society all the time today. One of the things that is so prevalent among some of these students that we're dealing with now is a smorgasbord, kind of a cafeteria plan of spirituality. You see it, don't you, sweetie? I guarantee you. It's out there. It's out there a lot. And they say, well, let me tell you, we are hardwired to be spiritual beings. We are hardwired to do that. And so some people will say, I'm a spiritual being, and I like some ideas of that Buddhism because I'm God in Buddhism. You know, I find no truth deeper than myself, and besides that, I'm a pretty smart person, and so my God is me. Some may claim other gods, but for the most part, secular humanism reigns, and they have alternatives. I'll do a little sprinkling of Buddhism, and I'll tell you what else is getting very popular now is orthodoxy. Because of the ritual and the icons, orthodoxy is very popular now. So I'll rely on getting a good spiritual feeling from orthodoxy, and as a backup, I've got Jesus. Jesus doesn't want to be your backup. Matter of fact, he virtually insists that he's not. He's the first. I had an affirmation this week, and I got to tell you, sometimes I just shake my head when things like this happen. But I had an example I wanted to close with today, and it's a hymn. And it's one we hadn't sung in a long time. And I've got the lesson all nailed down and ready to go. And when I came last Wednesday, I always go in and stop by and see the ladies who are doing the music in there. So I stopped by and saw what you were doing, and I looked in there. And our invitation today was Trust and Obey. The very hymn that I'd picked out, God laid on Phil's heart to be the invitation for today. Let me tell you about that hymn. In 1887, Daniel Towner was leading the music at a revival. Okay? During a testimony service that night, he heard a young man say, I'm not quite sure, but I'm going to trust and I'm going to obey. Now, those words struck Towner so much that he took them to his friend John Sammis, who was a very accomplished musician, and then he added lyrics. Towner wrote the tune, and the hymn Trust and Obey was published in 1887. Not a burden we bear, not a sorrow we share, but our toil he doth richly repay. Not a grief or a loss, not a frown or a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much, Lord, for the lessons that are all through your word to us, Father. How they are so much applicable for us today as they were for Jacob in that time. And Father, be it never that we would steal household gods as a backup plan for you, Father, because you are all we need. And I want to thank you for that love and watch care. Father, I want to thank you for these who come every week to study your word, make it blossom in their lives. For I ask it in the precious name of your Son. Amen.